I always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains, a solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest, a 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads, just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was. The same sagging roof. The same open door. The same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler, normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself stranded, miles from the nearest road with no clear way back. I had planned a 2-day trip through a national forest, a loop trail that climbed a ridge, offering a long stretch of exposed rock before descending back into dense pine forest. The route was well documented, moderate in difficulty, and heavily used in summer. But I had come in the early fall, just after the peak season, when the air was crisp and the crowds were gone. I parked at the trailhead before sunrise, checked my gear, and started up the path. The first few miles were easy, wide dirt trails, gradual incline, the sound of distant birds in the trees. I fell into my usual hiking rhythm, my boots pressing into damp soil, the weight of my pack settling comfortably on my shoulders. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. After about 4 hours, I reached the ridge, a long, narrow stretch of exposed rock, sloping gently upward. I took a break, sitting on a boulder, drinking from my water bottle. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. I looked ahead. The trail followed the ridge for another few miles before dropping into a valley, where I planned to camp for the night. I kept walking. The path was easy to follow at first, marked by small cairns, stacks of rocks left by other hikers. But as I moved further along the ridge, the markers became less frequent. I didn't think much of it at the time. The terrain was open with good visibility, and I could see where the trail should be leading. Then the wind shifted. A low, heavy gust swept across the ridge, colder than before. The sky had darkened, not storm clouds, but a dull, flat gray. I stopped, checking my map. The terrain didn't match what I expected. The ridge seemed narrower than it should have been, the drop-off steeper. I turned back the way I came, and nothing looked familiar. The cairns were gone. The boulders I had passed earlier weren't there. It was just open rock, sloping downward on both sides, with no clear path. My pulse picked up. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had a compass. I had my map. I had daylight. I moved carefully, picking my way back toward where I thought I had come from. but the terrain kept shifting. Small ridges and dips that hadn't been there before. I checked my map again, trying to orient myself. If I kept heading west, I would eventually hit the tree line, and from there I could find the trail again. I walked for over an hour. The trees never came. The landscape stretched endlessly in front of me. Barren rock, empty ridges. My legs ached from the uneven ground. My throat was dry, despite my water. Then I saw something ahead. First, I thought it was another cairn, a small stack of stones, slightly off balance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cairn at all. It was a pile of bones, not animal bones. My stomach clenched. I knelt, staring at them. The bones were old, yellowed, weathered by wind and rain. Some had been cracked as if by pressure. They were arranged in a rough circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I stood up, my breath coming fast. I turned, and I saw more, scattered across the rock in irregular intervals, small piles of bones, some barely visible under thin layers of dirt.
A femur, a shattered skull, a ribcage collapsed inward.
I backed away, my pulse hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lost. This was something else. I turned sharply and kept moving. The wind had died completely. The air felt thick, heavy. My own footsteps sounded wrong against the rock. Too loud, too sharp. I needed to get off this ridge. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to run. I moved downhill, hoping to find a slope that would lead me back to the trees. But the ground kept tilting in ways that didn't make sense. Angles that felt wrong, dips that should have been climbs. Then I saw the cave, a narrow opening, barely visible in the rock face, partially hidden by a ledge. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to go near it. But I needed shelter. I needed a place to stop, to think. I stepped inside. The air was colder, damp. The space wasn't deep, just a small hollow in the rock, barely tall enough for me to stand. But the walls were covered in scratches, deep, uneven gouges, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. I stepped closer, running my fingers over them. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a frantic repetition of shapes, tallies, hundreds of them carved deep into the stone. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. I turned to leave, and outside the cave, less than 50 feet away, something moved. It was low to the ground, barely more than a shadow against the rock. Crawling, moving with deliberate, jerky motions. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I scrambled down the ridge, slipping on loose stone, my pack throwing me off balance. My knees hit the ground hard, pain jolting up my legs. I pushed forward, breath burning in my chest. The landscape blurred, rocks, dips, uneven ground. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then trees. The moment I saw them, I sprinted. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms. My boots slammed into soft dirt. I kept going, running until my lungs felt like they would split. Then I collapsed. I lay there, gasping, my body shaking. The forest was silent, normal. I pulled out my map, my compass. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold them. But I wasn't lost anymore. I could find my way back. I walked for hours, refusing to stop. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I never reported what I found. I never told anyone about the bones, the scratches, the thing I saw, because I knew no one would believe me, and because I knew, somewhere out there, in the empty stretches of rock, in the places where the trail disappears, there are things you aren't supposed to find. And once you do, they don't let you go. The drive to the cabin took nearly 6 hours. I had left the city early, hoping to reach the place by late afternoon. but the last stretch of road was nothing but gravel and potholes. It slowed me down more than I expected. My truck bounced and groaned over the uneven path, tires spitting dust and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no other vehicles, not even an old hunting shack. Just miles of thick forest closing in from both sides, the trees growing taller and denser as I climbed higher into the hills. I had rented this cabin for a full week. I needed the break. Work had been draining me dry, and I couldn't stand the noise of the city anymore. I didn't want to hear cars honking or people yelling or the endless ringing of my phone. I wanted silence. I got what I asked for. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. Small, isolated, and simple. Just one room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs. No electricity, no running water, just an old rain barrel outside that was half full from the last storm. A shed stood a few yards away, filled with firewood and rusted tools. The trees pressed in from all sides, thick and dark. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, damp with the scent of pine and earth. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just whined through the branches. Perfect. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was stale, like no one had been here in months. Dust floated in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the small, grimy window. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as I set my gear down and took a look around. The cot was covered in an old wool blanket. A few dead leaves curled in the corners. The wood stove was cold, a few charred logs sitting untouched inside. A stack of old newspapers sat on the table, yellowed and brittle. I dropped my bag beside the cot and got to work setting up. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled the lantern with oil, and checked my food supply. I had packed everything I needed: canned beans, jerky, rice, a couple of protein bars. Enough to last the week. The first night, I kept things simple, heating up a can of chili on the stove and eating in silence. By the time the sun set, the forest outside had become a black wall. I hadn't realized how dark it would get without city lights. The cabin had only the lantern and the soft glow of the stove. Everything else beyond the window was pitch black. I stared out for a while, listening. Nothing, not even crickets. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went to bed early, listening to the crackling fire as I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. Something was moving outside. I stayed still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I listened, straining my ears. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. Could have been an animal, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It wasn't darting around like a raccoon or sniffing like a deer. It was deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wooden walls. I stood up slowly and stepped toward the window, peering out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited. The footsteps had stopped. I turned off the flashlight, climbed back into bed, and lay awake for hours listening. Morning came slow. The fire had died completely, and the air was cold. I sat up, stretched, and rubbed my eyes. My mind was still foggy from the restless night. Then I saw the footprints, right outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The dirt around the porch was soft from the recent rain, and the tracks were clear. They circled the entire cabin, stopping by the window before trailing off into the trees. My stomach twisted. It wasn't an animal. The prints were human, barefoot. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe some drifter had been passing through. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. But why would someone be wandering barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The forest was still, the air heavy and damp. The tracks led toward the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had driven 6 hours to get here. I had planned this trip for months. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had been half dreaming the footsteps in the night. I decided to stay. I spent the day keeping myself busy, chopped wood, cleaned up the cabin, took a short hike, making sure not to wander too far. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure to lock the door. I woke up to the creaking of the porch. Someone was standing outside. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The floorboards groaned under slow, careful steps. Then silence. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, clicked it on. The light reflected off the window, blinding me for a moment. I squinted, heart pounding. Then I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass. Filthy. Smiling. I recoiled, my pulse slamming in my ears. By the time I grabbed the hatchet from beside my bed and turned back, the face was gone. I rushed to the window, shining my flashlight out. Nothing but empty woods. The trees swayed in the wind, branches creaking. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, staring into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rest of my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. More footprints. Not just one set, dozens. They surrounded the cabin. Some led to the window. Others stopped at the door. My stomach turned. I had been surrounded all night. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my truck, shoving my gear inside. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hands shaking. The wires had been cut. My chest tightened. My head felt light. I turned, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt them watching. I grabbed my bag, my hatchet, and started walking. The nearest road was miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I walked fast, then faster, then I ran. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization, a small gas station on the edge of town. I stumbled inside, breathless, hands shaking. The clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't explain. I didn't know how to. I hitched a ride back to the city. Never went back for my truck. Never went back for anything. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but they had been close. Too close. I had been on the road for a long time, longer than I should have been, but that was how it always went. The money was good when the miles were high, and I was used to pushing it. That night, I was running a load of steel coils from Ohio down to Texas. A long stretch, mostly highway, not too many stops except for fuel and maybe a couple of hours of sleep if I could afford the time. The weather had been decent when I left, cold but clear, but the forecast had warned of rain turning to ice the farther south I got. That was the last thing I needed, especially hauling something as heavy as what was on my trailer. The first few hundred miles were uneventful. I ran through Kentucky, then Tennessee, making decent time. Traffic was light since it was late, and I preferred driving at night anyway. Less idiots on the road. I'd seen too many wrecks, too many people cut off an 80,000-pound truck like they had a death wish. I knew better than to get comfortable, though. Long-haul trucking has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, and the second you start thinking nothing's gonna go wrong, something does. It started just past the Arkansas border. The rain had been falling steady for a while, but the temperature was dropping, and I could feel the road getting slick under my tires. I eased up on the speed, kept a good distance from the few cars still out that late. I was on a long stretch of I-30, mostly trees on either side, no towns or exits nearby. The kind of road that can feel endless when you're tired and alone. My dash lights glowed dimly in the dark. The soft hum of the engine, the only sound besides the rain tapping against the windshield. I was about 100 miles from Texarkana when I saw the lights ahead. red and blue flashing in the dark, reflecting off the wet pavement. A wreck, I figured, not unusual in weather like this. As I got closer, I saw a line of trucks and cars slowing down, easing into the right lane. A couple of sheriff's cars were parked at an angle, blocking part of the road, and there was a cluster of people standing near the shoulder. I slowed to a crawl, trying to see what had happened. A jackknifed semi sat across the left lane, its trailer twisted at an angle. The cab looked mostly intact, but the front end of a smaller car was wedged underneath it, crushed almost beyond recognition. I could see first responders working around it, but from the way they moved, it was clear there was no saving whoever had been inside. I had seen enough accidents to know what that meant. Traffic was still moving, just slower, and as I crept past, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The semi's trailer was carrying steel coils, just like mine. Heavy loads like that can be dangerous if they're not secured right. If a coil comes loose in a wreck, it'll cut through a cab like a knife through butter. I kept my eyes on the road ahead and told myself to shake it off. No use thinking about it. The rain picked up not long after that, the temperature still dropping. I kept the heat on low, just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up. My hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel too hard, but I couldn't help it. The road was getting worse, patches of ice forming in spots, and I knew I had to be careful. I had another 300 miles to go before I could rest, and the last thing I needed was to end up like that guy back there. An hour passed, maybe more. The road stretched on, dark and empty, the only light coming from my headlights and the occasional glow of another truck in the distance. I was tired, but not enough to stop yet. I just wanted to get through the worst of the weather before I found a place to pull over. Then I saw something ahead. At first, it was just a shadow on the road, barely visible in the rain. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing in the middle of the highway. My heart jumped into my throat. I hit the brakes, careful not to lock them up on the ice, and my truck slowed with a groan. The figure didn't move, just stood there, barely illuminated by my headlights. My first thought was that it was a stranded driver, someone whose car had broken down. Maybe they had been walking to get help, and I was the first vehicle they had seen in a while. But something felt off. They weren't waving me down. They weren't moving at all. I eased onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a stop a few yards away. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling through the trees on either side of the road. I kept my lights on and tried to get a better look at the person. They were dressed in dark clothes, soaked from the rain, their heads slightly tilted down. Something in my gut told me not to get out. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Then, slowly, the person turned and walked toward the guardrail. They climbed over it and disappeared into the darkness beyond. I waited, staring at the spot where they had gone. The highway was bordered by thick woods in that area, no houses or businesses nearby. If they had a car, it wasn't anywhere I could see. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't about to go chasing someone into the woods in the middle of the night, especially in weather like this. If they needed help, there were better ways to get it than standing in the middle of the road. I reached for my radio and called it in, giving my location and a description of what I had seen. The dispatcher acknowledged it, said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking to the mirrors more often than usual. The feeling didn't leave me, that tight, uneasy knot in my stomach. I drove for another hour before I finally stopped at a truck stop near Texarkana. The rain had slowed, but the air was colder, the road still slick. I parked in the back lot, away from the other rigs, and shut the engine off. My body ached from the tension of the drive, my head pounding from lack of sleep. I sat there for a while, staring at the rain running down the windshield. The night was quiet, except for the occasional sound of another truck pulling in or leaving. I never found out who that person was. The next day, I checked the news, but there was nothing about a stranded driver or anyone found near that stretch of highway. No missing person reports that matched what I had seen. Just another cold, wet night on the road. I finished my run and moved on to the next haul, but I never stopped thinking about it. It wasn't the first strange thing I'd seen out here, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But something about that night stuck with me in a way others hadn't. Maybe it was the way they had stood there, unmoving. Maybe it was the way they had just disappeared into the dark. Or maybe it was the fact that when I looked back at my dashcam footage the next morning, there was nothing there. Just an empty highway and the rain. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Some people think it's reckless, but I've always found peace in the solitude. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, that makes the world feel simpler.
No emails.
No traffic. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned for 3 nights out in the wilderness, far from any official campsites. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from trails, near a small creek. It was a perfect place. Plenty of firewood, fresh water, and total isolation. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, hiked about 5 miles into the woods, and found a clearing big enough for my tent. The trees were thick on all sides, but there was just enough space for a fire pit and a decent view of the creek. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked some simple food over the fire as the sun set. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak in. Nights in the woods can be unnerving if you aren't used to them. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. I've learned to tune it out. Most noises are just animals going about their business. That first night, I slept deeply, the steady sounds of the creek lulling me into unconsciousness. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, hiking further upstream, fishing a little. The sun filtered through the trees, the scent of damp leaves filled the air, and I felt completely at peace. But as the sun started to dip, something felt different. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The woods were quieter than before. The usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling branches, felt more distant, like they were further away than they should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't listen. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach felt tight. My instincts were screaming at me, but I had no reason to feel that way. I stayed up later than usual, adding more wood to the fire, keeping it burning longer than I normally would. I told myself it was just a precaution, maybe a subconscious habit from too many nights alone in the wild. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was silent, too silent. I listened, barely breathing. No wind.
No insects.
No running water from the creek. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching. Slow. Careful. Not an animal. Someone was walking outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps were light, measured, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped, right next to me. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. No movement.
No retreating footsteps.
Just silence. I lay there, barely blinking, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Felt like hours. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, light was seeping through the fabric of my tent. Morning. I sat up slowly, my entire body stiff. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks. Then, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my tent. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They came from the trees, moved around my tent, and then nothing. No footprints leading away, like whoever it was had just vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw them, never heard them leave. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone. I had been driving long enough to know when something didn't feel right. I was running a long-haul trip from Illinois down to Arizona, hauling a load of construction materials, mostly rebar and steel beams, heavy but secure. It was a trip I'd done before, mostly interstate, no major mountain passes or tricky back roads. Just a lot of straight, open highway and long stretches of nothing in between. It was late September, the weather still decent but starting to cool off, especially at night. I had planned to make it down to a truck stop outside Oklahoma City before shutting down for a few hours, but I was running ahead of schedule. The road had been clear, and traffic was light, so I figured I'd push a little farther before stopping. I had been on the road for close to 11 hours already, only stopping for fuel once. I wasn't exhausted yet, but I could feel the weight of the drive settling in. My back ached, my legs felt stiff, and my eyes burned from staring at the road for too long. The sun had set about an hour ago, and the stretch of I-40 I was on was quiet, just the occasional set of headlights in the distance, most of them other truckers running night shifts like me. The sky was clear, the stars bright, but out here, that only made the emptiness feel bigger. I kept the cab cool to stay alert, the low rumble of the engine the only sound besides the tires humming against the asphalt. Then I saw something up ahead. At first, it was just a glow, taillights in the distance, dim and barely moving. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a vehicle on the side of the road. A pickup, dark-colored, pulled onto the shoulder at a slight angle. Nothing unusual about that. People pull over all the time. Maybe a breakdown, maybe a flat tire. I slowed slightly as I passed, just enough to check if there was someone outside needing help. There was no one, just the truck sitting there, idling, taillights glowing red in the dark. The driver's side door was open. I kept moving. Something about it didn't sit right. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone step out of the darkness, maybe waving for help, maybe just standing there watching. But there was nothing. After a few more miles, I let it go. It wasn't my problem. If they needed help, they could call for it. I had learned a long time ago not to get involved with roadside situations unless it was a real emergency. But then, about 20 minutes later, I saw another truck. Same make, same model, same dark color, same open driver's side door. This one was farther off the road, barely visible in the darkness. No hazards on, no signs of movement, just sitting there like the first one. I felt my grip tighten on the wheel. Something wasn't right. I kept my speed steady, forcing myself not to check my mirrors as I passed. My brain was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but nothing made sense. Two identical trucks, both abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I exhaled slowly, pushing the tension out of my shoulders. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Then I saw a third one. This time it was parked in the median, facing the wrong way. And this time there was someone inside. I only caught a glimpse as I passed, but it was enough. A figure sitting in the driver's seat, barely illuminated by my headlights. Not moving, not looking at me, just sitting there still as a statue. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my heart thudding in my chest. My breathing felt tight, my hands sweating against the wheel. I had seen some weird things out on the road, but nothing like this. My mind started running through the possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of police sting, though that didn't make sense. Maybe it was a setup, a bait trap for someone dumb enough to stop. Or maybe I shook my head. Didn't matter. I wasn't stopping. The miles passed, the road stretching ahead, dark and endless. I tried to focus, tried to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I saw the headlights. In my mirrors, far behind me, just two pinpricks of light at first. But they were moving fast, too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching as they gained on me. My stomach clenched as they got close enough for me to see. Pickup truck, dark-colored. I swallowed hard, keeping my hands firm on the wheel. My mind was racing now, running through my options. If they tried to run me off the road, I was heavy enough that they wouldn't win that fight. But if they had guns, I forced the thought down. Stay calm, stay smart. The truck pulled into the left lane, speeding up to match my pace. I didn't look over, didn't give them any reason to think I was rattled. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they cut their lights, vanished into the dark. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could still feel them there, somewhere, running beside me in the blackness. I kept going. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing. Then ahead of me I saw it. Another pickup, parked across both lanes. I hit the brakes, my tires screaming against the pavement, my trailer groaning from the sudden force. I felt my rig shudder, but I kept control, easing onto the shoulder as I came to a full stop. My lights washed over the truck blocking the road. It was empty. The driver's door was open, and behind me, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into reverse, slamming the pedal down. My trailer swung slightly as I backed up, my heart racing. Then, just before I hit the ditch, I cut the wheel hard and gunned it. The truck roared forward, my trailer fishtailing slightly as I tore back onto the highway. In my mirrors, I saw movement. Figures spilling out from the darkness, scrambling toward the abandoned truck. I didn't stop to see who they were. I just kept driving. I made it to the next town in record time, pulling into a well-lit gas station, my hands still shaking as I shut off the engine. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. No cops, no reports, nothing on the news, just another quiet night in the middle of nowhere. But I knew better. I never took that route again. Hiking alone wasn't new to me. I had done it for years, ever since I was old enough to understand a compass and tie my own boots. There was something about being out in the wild, away from people, away from the noise, that made me feel like I could breathe. The solitude was comforting. No distractions, no deadlines. Just me, my pack, and miles of wilderness. That's why I took this trip. I had found an old, nearly forgotten trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't marked on most maps, but I'd read about it on an old hiking forum. Just a few scattered posts, a handful of people mentioning it. Remote, hard to follow, not maintained. No signal, no rescue points, only for experienced hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. I planned a 4-day trek, packed everything carefully: tent, food, extra water, my knife, a small hatchet, first aid kit, map, compass, and a GPS unit. I checked everything twice. The drive out took most of the day. The last stretch was a dirt road, barely more than a trail itself, winding through thick forest. By the time I reached the old trailhead, it was late afternoon. There was no sign, no markers, just a narrow path leading into the trees. I stepped out of my truck, stretched, and listened. The forest was quiet, too quiet, but I shook it off, tightened my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were smooth. The trail was faint but still visible, winding through tall pines, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. No signs of anyone else, no footprints, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the distant sound of a creek somewhere to the east. I made good time, covering about 8 miles before dusk. I found a small clearing near a stream and set up camp. Cooked a quick meal, watched the fire flicker against the dark. The quiet felt deeper out here, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every sound, every rustling leaf, every crack of a branch. At one point, I thought I heard something moving beyond the firelight. A soft, slow step. I froze, listened. Nothing. Probably a deer, maybe a fox. I pushed it out of my mind and went to sleep. I woke up at first light, packed quickly, and got moving. The trail was harder to follow now. Overgrown, broken in places where fallen trees had obscured the path. My GPS still showed I was on track, but it was glitchy, struggling to hold a signal. A few hours in, I noticed something strange. A jacket. It was old, torn, half buried in the dirt beside the trail. The fabric stiff, the sleeves crumpled like someone had yanked it off in a hurry. No backpack, no footprints, just the jacket. I stared at it for a moment, then kept moving. The terrain grew rougher, steeper. The trees pressed in closer. Then I found the second thing. A boot, just one, lying in the middle of the trail. The laces missing, the tongue pulled back. It was newer than the jacket. Not fresh, but not ancient either. I looked around, listened. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind. I gripped my knife tighter and walked faster. By late afternoon, the trail had all but disappeared. I checked my GPS. It blinked, froze, then shut off completely. I pulled out my map and compass, adjusted my bearings, and kept going. Then I smelled it. Rot. Thick, sour, drifting through the trees. I followed it, stepping carefully off the trail. That's when I found the deer, or what was left of it. His body was torn open, ribs cracked wide. The insides were missing, the legs bent at odd angles. I crouched beside it, studying the wounds. Not from a bear, not from scavengers. The cuts were clean, precise, like they'd been made with a knife. I stood fast, scanning the trees. My pulse pounded. I was not alone. I turned and walked fast. I needed to get out. By nightfall, I was exhausted but refused to stop. The forest felt wrong. I pushed forward, using my headlamp to cut through the dark. My map showed a clearing up ahead, my best chance to set up camp. But when I reached it, my stomach dropped. There was already a campsite, old, abandoned. Tent, collapsed. A fire pit, cold. A backpack, torn open, its contents scattered. Food wrappers, a knife, rusted, and a notebook. I picked it up, flipping through damp pages. Something is wrong. I hear footsteps at night. It knows I'm here. I'm not alone. The last entry was smeared, written in shaky handwriting. It's watching. I dropped the notebook and backed away. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not mine. I killed my headlamp. Stood still. The steps stopped. Silence. My pulse pounded so loud I swore it would give me away. Then, a sound. Something breathing. Close. I turned and ran. Branches snapped around me. The forest was alive with movement. Something was following me. I sprinted through the trees, barely dodging roots and rocks. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. I ran until I saw the ridge, a sharp drop leading down to the lower forest. If I could make it, I could disappear into the trees. I slid down the slope, dirt and rocks cutting my hands. Hit the ground hard, stumbled forward. Silence. I turned back, gasping. Nothing. No movement. Just the dark, empty trees. I didn't stop. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. By the time I saw the road, the sky was turning gray with the first light of dawn. My truck was there, but so were the footprints, leading from the trees, stopping just short of my driver's side door. I didn't check the back seat. I didn't breathe until I was miles away. I never reported what I found, never went back. But sometimes, even now, when I'm alone at night, I swear I still hear those footsteps, still following, still waiting.